Okay, so there's an equation so famous you definitely learned it in school. A squared plus b squared equals c squared, the Pythagorean theorem. But what if I told you the story behind that name is one of history's biggest misunderstandings?
Yup, that one. It's the simple, elegant rule for any right triangle. If you imagine putting a square on each of the three sides, the two smaller squares will always add up perfectly to fill the big one. It just feels like one of those fundamental, unchanging truths of the universe. So the name kind of gives it all away, right? It has to be the Greek mathematician Pythagoras who first figured this out. Well, here's the thing. The real story is much, much older. And honestly, it completely changes how we should think about this famous equation. To find the real origin, we have to travel back in time. But we're not stopping in ancient Greece. No, we have to go even further back, to Mesopotamia, the incredible civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Now, just take a look at this timeline. That gap you see in the middle? That's not just a few years. It's over 1,000 years. The core idea, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle, was already being used in Mesopotamia around 1800 BCE. Pythagoras and the Greeks, they wouldn't even show up for another 12 centuries.
And don't think this was just simple arithmetic. Mesopotamian society absolutely depended on sophisticated math. I mean, if you wanted to build a towering ziggurat, or survey land after a flood, or map the stars, you needed really precise calculations. And lucky for us, they wrote it all down on clay tablets that have survived for thousands of years. And this really is the key takeaway from the source material. It's so clear. The Mesopotamians already knew the numerical facts. They might not have had a grand philosophical proof, but they had a working tool that let them build their entire world with stunning precision.
And if you want hard evidence, this is the smoking gun. This little clay tablet, known as Plimpton 322, is basically a cheat sheet of what we now call Pythagorean triples. You know, sets of whole numbers like 3, 4, and 5 that fit the theorem perfectly. This wasn't just a lucky guess. It was organized, systematic, mathematical knowledge.
So this leaves us with a historical puzzle, right? If the Mesopotamians were using this rule, why in the world do we still call it the Pythagorean theorem? Well, the answer comes down to this really crucial difference. The difference between knowing that something works and proving why it has to work every single time.
You can really break it down like this. On one hand, you have the Mesopotamians. They were the ultimate practical problem solvers. They knew that certain number combinations worked for building and surveying. On the other hand, you have the Greeks. They were abstract thinkers. They weren't just satisfied that it worked. They wanted to prove why the rule was true for every single right triangle that could possibly exist.
And believe me, those Mesopotamian needs were incredibly real. If you're building a city, you need perfectly square corners. If you're dividing up farmland after a flood, you need dead-on accurate surveying. This mathematical rule wasn't just some neat trick, it was an absolutely essential tool for building a whole civilization. Which, of course, brings us right back to the big question. If Mesopotamians were using this knowledge for more than 1,000 years, how did Pythagoras end up with his name on it? Well, it turns out there are a few key reasons his name stuck. For one, later Greek writers made the idea famous and tied it directly to him and his school. But, and this is the big one, his school is credited with creating the first surviving formal proof. And, as we see again and again in history, credit doesn't always go to the first person to spot something. It often goes to the person who can explain it, prove it, and make it famous. And that's a lesson that goes so far beyond just mathematics, right? History isn't always neat and tidy, and the famous name on the label doesn't always tell you the whole story. So, look, this isn't about saying the Greeks just stole an idea. Not at all. It's about understanding that discovery isn't a single flash of lightning. It's a long journey, a process that builds and grows over centuries. Think of it like a chain of knowledge being passed through history. The Mesopotamians forged those first critical links. They noticed a pattern, and they put it to incredible practical use. Then, centuries later, the Greeks came along and added the final essential links. They generalized the pattern and then formally proved it was true for absolutely all cases. And you know, far from diminishing anyone's achievement, this secret history actually makes the theorem's story even more impressive. It shows that human intelligence is this shared, beautiful thing that grows across cultures and across centuries, with different civilizations adding their own essential pieces to the puzzle. It's amazing. And that leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. If the story behind something as basic as a squared plus b squared equals c squared is this rich and complicated,
What other great discoveries that we take for granted are really just the final famous step in a much longer hidden journey? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.